everyone. Welcome back to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, the podcast for all disciplines, paths, players, and game masters, and the questers that are Josh and Dan. I am Dan.
I am Josh.
And on today's podcast, we'll be discussing all things quizzical and arrowantical, because we're going to get to the horror-marked dragon Vestrivan, but we have some emails to get to first. So, with that being said, if you have any questions for us that you'd like us to answer for you and or get your name read aloud on the podcast, feel free to contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. And until we hear from you, let's hear from these fine folks. Anything you want to say to start off, Josh, or should I just get right to it?
Get right to it.
All right. Hi again, Rasmus. Almost caught up. Last time I wrote, I was listening to episode 19, and you answered my question in episode 83. Right now, I'm listening to episode 86. Still loving what you are producing. Really cool to hear you talk about different aspects of the best RPG system ever. And now to a few questions. He's got 7 of them. Lightning round for Josh. Number 1. In earlier editions, you could actually buy thread items out of the companion. A lot of those rather simple items are, as far as I can see, not covered in 4th edition. For example, amulets, brooches, boots, rings of accuracy, and more. If I would introduce them as treasures in my 4th edition campaign, can I use them as written? Or are there some considerations I should take into account transferring them into 4th edition?
I think you can use them pretty much just as is. I haven't looked at them recently to see if there's anything about them that is no longer in line with the guidelines we have for thread items. They would all, I think, be novice tier items, so with only 4 ranks. And as I seem to recall, yeah, they were all fairly pretty basic, like just offering defense bonuses and things like that. So I wouldn't see any problem with using them as is. You might want to just double check real quickly and see that the powers that they're given follow the guidelines that are in the GM's guide for what's available at novice tier ranks. I mean, they're all fairly basic items, and I'm pretty sure that they don't break any established guidelines for how items should work.
Fair enough. Question number 2. Can you combine some armors to get a higher armor rating? Some of the armors, like a cloak, would make sense to wear over another armor, but does the armor rating therefore stack?
No. 4th edition does not have stacking armor. There has always been a little bit of discussion, mainly because of the Espagra scale cloak, which was described as providing the equivalent protection to leather armor, and some rules in earlier editions allowed stacking with that. One of the things you need to keep in mind is that chainmail is not actually just the chain. There is also padding and so forth underneath it. So I'm not sure how you actually would layer armors like that. The only thing that potentially would layer would be a cloak. And just for simplicity's sake, we don't deal with that. The only armor stacking that occurs is for Obsidimen, where their natural armor does stack with living armors that they are able to wear. So an Obsidimen wearing Blood Pebble would have 8 physical armor instead of just the 5. But that's the only stacking that happens.
To that point, his follow-up question, can you combine Blood Pebble with other armors as they more or less are just part of your skin?
No. Again, just because of the stacking armor rules, armor is, especially in 4th edition, a little bit more valuable because it can't get overcome so easily. If you want to really get into higher armor levels, higher armor ratings, that's where the Forge Armor ability for weaponsmiths comes into play, or even threaded versions of armors can increase the armor value that those provide.
Fair enough. Also armor related, would it make sense to let dwarves with their strong back ability get less of an initiative penalty from armor?
I think there are actually knacks in the companion or mystic paths that do that.
Very cool.
As written, no, but I think actually there are knacks that do that, and I can't recall which book they're in off the top of my head to find them.
No worries. But at least there's a thread you kind of pull on to see if it will bear any fruit that way.
Continue.
All right. Number 4, flame weapon. Can it be cast on a single arrow? Elaborating on the question from episode 69. Because we have to remember like 30-odd episodes ago.
No.
I believe that flame weapon was only for melee weapons.
As written, no. I would not allow flame weapon to be cast on an arrow. That said, I would not necessarily have a problem with a separate spell that would be created to perhaps do something similar. I mean, Nethermancers have both Arrow of Night and a flame weapon-like spell that they can put on melee weapons. So I absolutely could see an elementalist having a spell that would do something similar for arrows.
Yeah.
Oh, quick. I was just saying, I was flipping through. The knacks that I was thinking of are in the companion, page 114. Let me just double check. Yes. There are 3 knacks that are thread weaving knacks that are available to dwarves: strength of bronze, strength of iron, and strength of steel. Those are knacks that allow reduction of initiative penalties because of that. So there are knacks that do that sort of thing.
Nice. I did look up flame weapon, and it just says it engulfs a weapon. It doesn't actually say anything about a melee weapon, but I think that was the intention. Letter of the law, spirit of the law thing.
I would not allow flame weapon to be cast on an arrow, but I would be curious to see a similar type of spell that might provide a damage bonus to arrows the way that Arrow of Night does for Nethermancers.
Yeah, fair. Question number 5. Just to be sure, when you suffer a wound from an attack, you only suffer 1 wound, no matter how high the damage? In older editions, we always used a wound per each times the damage beat your wound threshold. Some wound thresholds, 10, suffering 30 damage would get 3 wounds.
That is a house rule that a lot of people used. That is never how it has actually been rules as written. Regardless of how much damage you suffer, you should only suffer 1 wound. There are a couple of creature abilities, maybe horror abilities. There's a high circle talent or knack that allows you to deal multiple wounds if you deal multiples of the wound threshold. But those are specific powers that call out that they do that. Otherwise, regardless of how much damage you suffer, you still only suffer 1 wound. That's why something like Bone Shatter was such a nasty spell, was because it was actually multiple effect tests, and so each effect test could impose a wound. There were a couple of other spells in first edition that specifically called out that they dealt multiple wounds. Bone Pudding, I think, is another one that dealt multiple wounds.
I think you're right.
I mean, wounds are nasty enough just because of the penalties and so-called death spiral that can occur. Having multiple wounds result from a single source of damage by default is a little bit overpowered. I mean, it's something you can certainly do if you want to have a more deadly game, but that's an ability that, as written, does not become available until higher powered creatures and higher circle characters, when death ratings and step numbers and so forth are high enough that the resulting penalties and such are not going to necessarily be instantly crippling to a character.
Lest we forget falling damage, where those wounds are automatic and they do...
Yeah, if you are falling a significant distance, you can also suffer from multiple wounds as a result of the fall. Again, it is specifically called out in those places where you would suffer from more than 1 wound.
Yes. Wanted to make sure falling damage got lumped in there. Other than that, question number 6. Would it make sense to expand the chain casting rules to talents with a longer duration? For example, a permanent sacrifice of a recovery test to always have Woodskin active for a bonus of the talent step to hit points.
That's one possibility. One place that you might want to go and look is at Morgan's blog. Morgan has done some theory crafting revisions, changes to some of the talents, and I seem to recall that Woodskin was one of the ones that he played with, maybe going back a little bit farther to the longer duration that it had. So that's one place you might look. I don't really have anything more to say than that. I understand the situation sort of with regards to Woodskin. But once you get up into, especially once you get up into Journeyman circles and you've typically got it at like rank 5, 6 or whatever, the duration of it is long enough that you're not apt to run into any issues the way that you do at ranks 1 and 2.
Yeah, fair enough. Question number 7 from Rasmus. Could you spend a little time talking about challenge ratings? I'm not sure I understand it perfectly, and balancing combat encounters is important. For a group of 5 first circle adepts, would 5 creatures with challenge rating 1 be an appropriate challenge? And would the same group be similarly challenged by 1 challenge rating 5 creature? I think not. Please give some advice to challenge ratings and numbers of opponents compared to a mixed group of adepts. Again, thank you for a fantastic podcast.
Well, thank you, Rasmus. Challenge ratings are a rough way to gauge the appropriate difficulty of a combat encounter. A lot of what that indicates is sort of on the back end, we've got a algorithm of sorts that helps, at least for a certain challenge rating, set the baseline stats for something and then kind of has a rough allotment of points that can be spent on it to increase other things. Generally speaking, a group of characters against a group of equivalently challenged ratinged creatures is a good place to start. One of the things that you do want to look at, and we talked about this in an earlier episode, is doing a more like breakdown point by point comparison of attack steps versus defense ratings and spellcasting steps versus mystic defense and average damage output versus death ratings and wound thresholds and armor, and kind of calculating that sort of stuff out. You are correct in that a group of 5 first circle characters would be having a hard time with a challenge rating 5 opponent for a couple of reasons. One is that when you bump up in tier like that, generally speaking, barring special abilities or other stuff, novice tier creatures, novice tier opponents have a single action. When you bump up into Journeyman, they tend to get 2. That's one thing that is notable. Obviously, this is part of the reason why Cadaver Men are actually gauged as a tougher opponent in 4th edition than they have been in previous ones. That's because of their rage ability and the bonuses that they get and the multiple attacks that they frequently get as a result of their special stuff. There's also the fact that, on average, a 5th circle opponent is going to have steps and defense ratings and so forth that are, on average, 4 to 5 points higher than a 1st circle opponent. And that's a notable spike in difficulty. Remember that within the mechanics, the basic foundational math of the step system is that a character who is rolling a step 10 is going to have about a 50% chance of success against a target number of 10. So if they're attacking somebody with a physical defense of 10 with their sword, then they will hit about half of the time. The more that target number goes up, the greater the difference is. Off the top of my head, I want to say on average, it's about a 3 to 4% decrease in the chance of success for every point difference that the target is higher than the step, on average. It's a little bit more fiddly than that, but that's kind of how it works out. And so if you've got a first circle character who typically is going to have maybe a step 8 or a 9, maybe a step 10 in their primary attack step, whether that's spellcasting or melee weapons or whatever, and is going against an opponent who is a circle equivalent circle 5 challenge rating, is likely to have defense ratings in the 13, 14, 15 range, you're looking at that point of only a 35% chance of hitting them on average, which means they're only going to be hitting maybe 1 round in 3. And then on top of that, you've got probably a little bit higher armor rating, which means even when they do hit, they're not going to be getting as much damage in. They're not as likely to be scoring extra successes. There's a lot of little things that don't seem like they're a big deal, but they all kind of stack on top of each other. Now, karma can help overcome that shortcoming to a certain extent, but low circle characters have lower reserves of that.
4, 5, 6 points a day.
Yeah.
Tops.
Generally, I'm not a huge fan of throwing a single overscaled opponent at a group of lower circle characters because it messes with the action economy and it tends to not make a particularly interesting encounter because you've got just basically the player characters will pile on them and you maybe end up with a kind of glass cannon situation where the bad guy gets nasty hits in, but just through sheer
blind luck and
numbers and dice rolling. I mean, eventually, somebody's going to roll something really well and maybe cause some problems. It just doesn't make for a particularly dynamic or interesting scene. It's much better to maybe have an opponent, like a quote unquote boss opponent that is maybe 1 or 2 equivalent circles higher, maybe with a weakness that the group can exploit, like the boss creature is scaled to be resistant against physical attacks, like it has a higher physical armor and a higher physical defense, but it is weaker against mystic attacks. And it's got a lower mystic armor, so maybe mystic stuff can go against it a little bit better. Or maybe there are maneuvers that can be done against it that will help overcome those strengths that it has. So you can get some kind of tactical thinking in there. But then have them supplemented by sidekicks, minions, additional creatures in there, or opponents that are maybe not as tough as the player characters, but still pose a threat just in terms of if they gang up on someone, then you start getting blindside bonuses and harried penalties on the character. They can maybe get past them to go against the squishier people in the back, the spellcasters and things like that, so that you need to think about the tactics of the scene. That's why in general, I think it's better to go with a mixed group, maybe 1 or 2 that are a little bit tougher and some others that are weaker. But the math really is not as simple as I've got the equivalent of 10 circles in my group of player characters, therefore I can throw 10 circles of opponents at them, and that's a fair fight.
Not so much.
It's always good to throw easy fights at the group now and again, especially once they've got a little bit of experience under their belt so they can feel how they have advanced and take advantage of their tricks, especially if it's an opponent that maybe have given them a little bit of trouble before. One of the other things, again, pointing back to Morgan's blog, if you do like the idea of a boss fight type encounter, Morgan's blog, and it's appeared in a couple of other places as well. There's a mask, a legendary mask, and what that tends to do is give more reaction type abilities and other things that trigger when the enemy reaches certain thresholds of damage, so that it deals with the action economy of what happens when you've got 4 or 5 or 6 player characters going against a single opponent.
Fair enough. Thank you, Rasmus, for the lovely conversation. You took up 20 minutes of the podcast this time.
I hope that addressed his question.
Oh, no, that should answer the question. If not, I'd be amazed if it did not answer the question. Because, as you said, the economies of scale and how the dice roll, the higher your target numbers are harder to do at first and second circle. On to Jason. Jason says, Dan, I got to tell Josh in person how much I appreciate your guys' work and wanted to drop a line to thank you as well. You guys have inspired me to start running a game after 15 years and 5-ish years away from in general. Josh may be the lore master, but the podcast would still not be nearly the same without your voice. You two do a great job riffing off each other. Thank you. Josh, again, thank you so much for signing my books. You and Morgan are doing a great job. Jason. Josh got to give an autograph.
Oh, I've done that before, but this was at Gen Con this past year.
A couple weeks ago.
Jason came by and had books, and I got to sign them. I was a little bit surprised that I got to sign books this year, because I frequently sign books at Gen Con because we have the booth where people buy books, and if I'm there frequently, they will buy books, and I will sign them there if they want.
Absolutely.
But it was great to chat with you briefly. He stopped by before a game that I was running, and I got to sign his books.
Cool. Folks, in case you're wondering, I do not have Josh's autograph, but I do have his phone number.
I was going to say, actually, I've given that out to a lot of people because my phone number is on my Facet Games business cards, and I tend to give a lot of those out too.
Exactly. There you go.
But I appreciate you saying that Morgan and I do a great job. It is not just the two of us. It is also Kyle and Michael and Carl and Andy and James and the whole crew really all contribute.
Yes, bang up job, all. On to Shane. Good morning, Questers. If you would like to, this can be read in the character as Veridan, the stuffy British dwarf sage. So, he didn't say I had to, but I'm gonna, because the challenge has been laid before me. So, I note in your last correspondence about that terror of the Liège jungle Usum that you had no questions or emails. This outrageous occurrence must not continue, so here's a question for you, one that has haunted me for an answer for some time now. If you could turn your expertise to it and grant me your wisdom, that would be much appreciated. The question is thus. How much tail could a tail dancer dance if a tail dancer could dance tail? As much tail as a tail dancer could dance if a tail dancer could dance tail seems likely. However, if a tail dancer, for reasons of horror mark or Denderastus interference, cannot indeed dance tail, then in that situation how much tail can a tail dancer not dance if a tail dancer cannot dance tail? How was that, Shane?
That was nice. I don't have an answer.
We'll take that. I don't either, because it was a fun one, and we're going from there. On to Jonathan. Hey guys, what's up? Thanks for your answers on my last email. Tonight I have other questions. Some of them about Bone Circle spell and Bone Spirits. This is right up Josh's nethermantic alley. Not a euphemism. First, is an active Bone Circle visible? Does the Bone Spirit inside, is it always manifested, or does it manifest out of nowhere when an unwary traveler steps into the circle?
It depends.
Love that answer.
When the spell is initially cast, there is the actual circle of bones that is laid out as part of the ritual that is performed, but those bones do not need to stay in place. Even if they are removed, the bone circle itself stays behind. I would say normally, like if you're just kind of standing around and looking at it, if the bones are still in place, then you may notice the physical circle, but not necessarily anything special about it. If the bones aren't there, there wouldn't be any way to tell. However, if you were to look at astral space, you would see the astral presence of the spell and or spirit in that location. Mm-hmm. So, kind of, but definitely in certain circumstances. The bone spirit is not always manifest. In fact, more than likely, it's likely to kind of hang out in astral space rather than being in the physical. Mm-hmm. But obviously, if it is manifest for some reason, then that would be obvious the same way that anything else would be.
Fair. Second, is there a picture of a bone spirit somewhere in any of the books in any edition?
Not that I know of off the top of my head, but there is not a standard appearance for spirits. An individual spirit may appear the same way all the time.
Yeah.
Or certain classes of spirits might appear kind of similarly. So I would imagine that bone spirits typically are kind of skeletal in some sense, perhaps even being made up of astral versions of the bones that were used to make the circle.
Makes sense.
Even beyond maybe just appearing skeletal, but perhaps taking on some kind of form where if for some reason, like you wanted to go that route of, oh, they look like the bones that were used to make their circle, if you didn't have a skull, for example, that the bone spirit might not have a skull, but that might have this kind of head that's put together of other bones to make a kind of scully or head-shaped appearance. I imagine if you took a bunch of finger and toe bones, like phalanges and stuff, and used them to sculpt a head, like you could maybe see that kind of thing. But they are creatures of astral stuff, and so can have a little bit of a varied appearance. In fact, I would be even willing to allow nethermancers who cast bone circles to define a little bit what their bone spirit would look like.
Yeah. Wing rats. Why wing rats from the Travar book aren't suitable as an animal companion? I feel like they should be, and I would like to have one.
By default, it's because they are horror corrupted, horror twisted kind of things.
Petty details.
That's the primary reason. If you want to allow it at your table, we can't stop you.
No.
It's mainly the fact that they're kind of horror constructy type things.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Finally, again, the Journeyman path. It is not a question, but an add-on to your answer. Remember the last time I asked if a journeyman could become tail dancers while transformed into T'Skrang, or if they could become fire eaters while mimicking Gahad? The answer was, unsurprisingly, no. Reasons were given from the point of view of tail dancers and fire eater masters, but I think it works the same from the journeyman perspective. What I mean is that all of the dedication it would require in one particular race to achieve acceptance and mindset toward one of those paths would be so great it would go against the journeyman's code. Because, by definition, the journeyman needs to spread their learning across as many disciplines, races, and cultures as possible. Focusing too much on one specific thing is kind of breaking their rules. So he tacked on a little thought to our discussion.
That is a fantastic insight, and I have no problem
Wonderful
with that.
Summary.
And that was actually sent before the episode that dropped earlier today, which was our episode about Journeyman, which brings us to another email from Jonathan, who writes, "Hey guys, me again. I just wrote you last night, so I didn't know that the podcast of today would be about the Journeyman.
Yes.
I gotta say, my longest played character was a Journeyman, started in 1st edition, converted to 3rd. At the end of the campaign, Spader was a 14th Circle Journeyman. That's pretty impressive. That being said, I still have a question about the path.
Well done.
Since the talents are learned from the ranks in the path and not from the ranks of versatility, I was under the impression that those talents work like any talent options, which means that you can spend karma on them and learn knacks from them as normal. Am I correct?" I was not sure of the answer to that, so just before we started recording, I messaged Morgan and I said, "Hey, here's a question." And Morgan came back and said, "Yes, they behave like any talents that are learned through a path, which means that you can spend karma on them, you can learn knacks from them as appropriate, etc., etc." So yes, you are in fact correct. If I gave the impression otherwise in the previous episode, I was wrong. I was thinking of them as just extensions to versatility, and that's not actually the case. They are learned and treated as any talents that are learned under a path. You just have a lot of options for doing it.
Fair. Morgan to the rescue.
Which, as an addendum to our episode from last week, I would then want to say that may be something to keep in mind if you are planning to be a journeyman. That may be something to keep in mind in terms of what talents you would learn under versatility and what talents you would save to learn through your path because of your ability to spend karma or learn knacks. If that's something that, if there are particular talents where you would be shooting for that, then you might want to save picking them up until you can learn them under the path.
Okay. That brings us to the end of the email section of this podcast. And if you have any questions for us as well, if you want to tack on a thought like Jonathan did, contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. Don't call Josh's number. Not a good way to get those questions answered on the podcast. And probably a blocked phone number after that. Anyway, on to Vestrivan.
Yeah.
All things Arrowentical here. And Josh has this wicked evil grin on his face because he loves talking about Vestrivan in this case.
He's kind of cool.
You're looking forward to it.
I don't like talking about him as much as I like talking about Alakia. I will say that up front.
Well, no. That's like 1 and then 5. So there's a gap there.
Yeah, in fairness, there is a lot more to talk about when it comes to Alakia. But yes. Vestrivan is pretty cool.
Yes. I remember looking through the Creatures of Barsave book and discussing it with my friends that, oh yeah, here's some nasty creatures, and anything with the letter V at the beginning was just horrible. Period. Vergigorm, Vestrivan, Vasdenjas, anything with a V was just one of the nastiest things you can come across, because once we got to Vestrivan, I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, there's a horror-marked dragon? Yes, it's possible. And they proved it right there that, yeah, this is the one thing. Go fight a dragon if you're stupid enough. Go fight a horror if you're really stupid enough. Fighting a horror-marked dragon? Triply stupid. That's just a factor of, yeah, not your best move there. But Vestrivan is the broodmate of Vasdenjas, late Vasdenjas, and that was something that I had forgotten until I reread the essay a little while ago. That, yeah, they were both. They had twin-shelled eggs, tip to tip, and so they were birthed at the same time and clutched at the same time by the same great dragon. And so Vestrivan and Vasdenjas were brothers in a sense that there was no closer they were ever going to be. unless they were twins, but they're not twins. So they shared the dragon speech between eggs before hatching, and so they were each other's closest contact. So anyway, one of those things there. But they both studied under Thurmail as the lore master, and they both courted Thurmail. She chose Vasdenjas, which might have led to a slight bitter rift between the two of them. One of those things. And as the Scourge approached, Vestrivan made contact with the horrors on purpose because of his curiosity on all things magic. And we mean all. That includes horror powers. So he contacted them and had to kind of fight them off over the course of the next 40 years because that horror eventually did corrupt him, and they now kind of live in the same body. It's kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde horror Vestrivan in the dragon's body. So which personality you're going to get whenever you come across them. Hopefully you should not come across them because that would not be a wise move.
Yeah. There is an element of tragedy to Vestrivan's tale, as some of the best aspects of Earthdawn really have a little bit of tragedy to them.
Oh, yes.
Where he, in his quest to learn everything that he could, very similarly to his brother, who is also a very knowledge-driven and academic type of dragon. They are in some ways very similar in that regard. And so their relationship as siblings and the story that comes out as a result of what happened between them and about them, where Vasdenjas ended up pursuing his quest for knowledge and lore and information into becoming lore master of the Barsavian dragons, a position of some import within their society. And then his sibling, Vasdenjas, who, in the course of that same pursuit of knowledge, fell and was corrupted by the horrors. In particular, the horror known as the Despoiler of the Land, about whom we do not know a whole lot, except that he and Vestrivan, to the surprise of Mountain Shadow, are, as you said, sort of a Jekyll and Hyde, like two minds in one body. And it is not a simple case of, oh, he is corrupted. It is actually sort of a struggle between the two, and one or the other may be in control at any given time.
Yeah. And that makes for an interesting thing, because the Despoiler of the Land is the only thing they know about the horror. Because if the horror's name was actually to be found out by the dragon, by any dragon or the Council of Dragons, they could begin to do maybe ritual magic or some other form of dragon magic to kind of help save Vestrivan, because they feel he's worth saving. And of course, casting out any horror is a good idea. But yeah, Vestrivan is, like you said, a tragic tale of he did this to himself because he wanted to. So they had literally, you have to save him from himself in this case. So the question is the horror, because it's laid out in the essay a little bit, and Mountain Shadow pushes back a touch to say, is the horror an unnamer or a depatterner? Thoughts, Josh?
That's a really good question. That is what the Outcast theorizes, that part of what is going on in the struggle between the Despoiler and Vestrivan is this attempt by the Despoiler to unname the dragon, but that the very nature of dragons as the original name givers, as ones who name themselves, that perhaps the power of a great dragon, even though technically Vestrivan is not counted among their number, as Vasdenjas' sibling, would be a great dragon were he not under the influence of the horror. Yeah. And so the reason that this is going on, perhaps, is because of the highly magical nature and the strong magical knowledge and reinforcement and understanding of magic that he has as a dragon, as a great dragon, to at least at times shake off the influence of the horror and to reassert his own personality and control of the body in defiance of that creature. And it is that aspect of things, that theory, that gives Mountain Shadow possible hope that he might yet be saved.
So it's interesting that, as I said, it's kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde thing, and I was going to use the Incredible Hulk, which is based upon Jekyll and Hyde as well, that Vestrivan's lair is unknown, possibly not even in Barsave, but it's guessed at that he doesn't lair anymore, and that while the Despoiler of the Land does all the evil things that he does, when Vestrivan gets control again, he's aware of all the things that the Despoiler did and goes and undoes those. So it's at least guessed at that it's the Jekyll has to go fix Hyde's mistakes or intentional evil and has to get that done. But it is also guessed at that the Despoiler does have a lair in the Twilight Peaks, possibly facing Death's Sea. So the horror might lair somewhere, as far as that personality controlling the dragon is concerned, but the dragon doesn't because, I got to go fix all the stuff that the horror, did wrong.
Yes. It is also discussed that the Despoiler poses as Vestrivan and acts as a mentor of sorts to students of magic that come to him. And of course, because he is a horror, corrupts them and turns them to his ways. And we get kind of hints of a possible secret society of sorts that serves this being, typically traveling in groups of half a dozen with a powerful spellcaster backed up by some physical types. But because of the influence of the horror, they are not able, fortunately, to take advantage of pattern magic because, according to the Outcast's theory, the unnaming aspects of the horror's magic, the corruption or the damage to their patterns is not, does not allow that enhancement through the use of pattern magic to take place.
It's a nice way to work in anybody who thinks they want to meet Vestrivan, or a nice little game master trick to use to, entice people along this route. Because, as you said, it's the guys of a magical school, and he's not teaching them nethermantic magic or elementalism magic. He's secretly teaching them horror magic, possibly to corrupt them, and then, go spread that word as well. And he does actually have servants. The Despoiler of the Land actually has servants that go travel Barsave recruiting for this on purpose. The most notable is an obsidian wizard named Urgulan, who gathers orphans and discarded children. So how creepy and evil can you get?
It's a real Dark Pied Piper sort of vibe that's going on, where he pays parents who are in dire financial straits for their children and takes those children off to the Despoiler's lair to indoctrinate them and make them servants of the horror. This is, I think, perhaps one of those great little thread campaign hook things.
Mm-hmm.
This was dropped at the very, very tail end of first edition.
Yeah.
And obviously, as a result, was never followed up at all. But this is a great hook and idea for how your player character group might get involved with storylines that involve Vestrivan and the Despoiler of the Land that, would not involve actually facing such a powerful entity.
Oh, yeah.
Coming to learn the machinations of his cultists, of people who were raised by him and are wholly dedicated to his service, and that he's got this sort of powerful wizard who actively recruits by taking advantage of people in difficult situations, whether that is purchasing children from downtrodden parents or orphans or, other street folk. There's a lot of story potential, a lot of pathos that you can get out of that, because there are plenty of examples in various Earthdawn materials about the difficulties, and it's a common trope in fantasy fiction about the difficulties that orphans and street kids and so forth face as a result of the life that they have.
Yeah.
there's potentially a lot of stuff that could come about as a campaign story arc with regards to dealing with agents of the Despoiler.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and eventually drawing the attention of the cult and dealing with it and dealing with Ergolon and possibly, if the campaign goes on long enough and your group gets powerful enough, to either redeem Vestrivan or slay him. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to be dealing with that sort of thing directly, then you are potentially going to involve other dragons in that.
Yeah, probably.
Having their magical knowledge or support in some respect, depending on what you're trying to do, might be a very useful thing to have. So that is an idea that you could perhaps bring in for a higher powered campaign. Much like there's a lot of idea on the Bloodwood and redeeming it or leaving it as is, or what kind of situation that you might have there. You can look at a storyline dealing with Vestrivan as, what are we going to do about this powerful entity who is, in a sense, a victim of the horrors, but is also very, very dangerous because of that corruption and that influence that they have been under for centuries.
Yeah. So I think this is the dragon you can probably work in easier than any of the others, because there's so many ways you can involve the history, the story, the possibility of Vestrivan, as far as you can come across somebody you can maybe come across Ergolon in the process of acquiring some of these children, or you can come across a town where he just left and had all that happen. So, chase him down. Maybe you come across the cultists who are recruiting, and maybe one of your party members wants to go in that as well. Or you've come across this seed where you want to find Vestrivan's lair, not the Despoiler of the Land's lair in Death Sea. Maybe you want to go find Vestrivan's lair to see what he was looking up. Maybe you can find the horror's name and bring that to the Council of Dragons. And I mean, there's a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, or possibly in the search for pattern items that maybe as part of the effort to restore Vestrivan to himself, you might need to perform a ritual involving one or more of his pattern items to channel magic through those and to reinforce his natural pattern as a dragon, to perhaps provide him strength to throw off the influence of the horror. When you start dealing with super powerful ritual magic like that, there aren't any rules for it. And you just kind of make stuff up to a certain extent for dramatic purposes. But that's something that could certainly be important there. You have the creatures book handy. What are the numbers that are in there? To give a ballpark figure for folks, what are we looking at for the numbers when it comes to Vestrivan?
These are first edition stats, so take them with a small grain of salt, but I don't think things change a whole lot. We're talking attributes. The lowest attribute he has is his dexterity of an 18. Otherwise, everything else is at least 22. The highest one is his toughness at step 26. Initiative step 20, 3 attacks per turn. Damage on his bite is step 32. Claws are step 30. His physical defense is a 24. Spell defense 27. Social defense 20. And then you get to the armor. Armor 27. Mystic armor 16.
So he's roughly equivalent. I'm looking at the stats here for the first edition Western Dragon.
Yeah,
they're roughly about the same there. He's got slightly lower physical stats and a little bit higher mystic stats. Yeah, his spell defense is a good 5 points higher than the spell defense for a Western Dragon, but his physical defense is a couple of points lower.
Yeah,
so roughly equivalent there. But the scarier part, I think, gets down to the bottom where you start looking at powers. Where I think in that book, if I'm recalling correctly, because I don't have it right in front of me.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Here's a selection of dragon powers, plus he gets a bunch of horror powers as well.
Pick 8 of each. Just Game Master, pick 8 of each. And the rules paragraph, I think, was the most one. Vestrivan is intended as an enigma, and so almost no information is available about his powers. Vestrivan has all the physical characteristics of a great dragon, as well as several magical abilities commonly associated with dragons. When he bonded with a horror, Vestrivan also gained many horror powers. So that's it. It's one of those, whatever the game master wants to do with Vestrivan, it's up to them in your campaign. The death rating of 240, good. Yeah, go for it.
Physically, he is as tough as a great dragon would be.
Mm-hmm. The body of, yes.
Yeah. He's got the physical body and prowess of a dragon with all of the powers that would be attendant upon that. So dragon breath and armored scales
And.
But then you toss on another 8 horror powers, and we've talked about horror powers, that there are some really nasty sorts of things there, which means that potentially you can do like horror marks and various other...
all kinds of nasty stuff.
Yeah.
Nasty stuff. Corrupt karma and all kinds of things.
Vestrivan does not get the attention that the Outcast does in terms of being an enemy dragon, but he is absolutely set up to be an antagonist of some sort.
Or as I call him, the big bad nasty.
Yeah. There was some musing about Vestrivan possibly showing up in the original outline of Bar Save at War, because the original version of that was never produced. It's unclear whether that would have actually happened. There were some ideas in that book that I think Lou has said sort of after the fact that he probably wouldn't have done them, like the Return of the Earth Dawn, for example.
Yeah.
That he wasn't sure whether that would be. But this entry of Vestrivan in the original Dragon source books is one of those things that here is something that we can put out there with some hooks built in to be a campaign level opponent potentially, and to provide some lore and background and some reason for maybe why we might do something cool with him later on, whether that is to involve him in the war somehow.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Vestrivan, there is a lot of potential there in terms of high circle epic play.
Yeah.
The restoral of a corrupted dragon to his self, if that is something that happens, would have some pretty significant ramifications in terms of the relationships between the great dragons and potentially some kind of shift in the balance of power between them. That is certainly an epic quest, the kind of major campaign closing climax that just is fantastic, and certainly something to look at if you've got a game that's going to be dealing at that significant a power level.
So since Vestrivan and Vasdenjas were broodmates, essentially as close as brothers can possibly be, and the 4th edition timeline has updated to Vasdenjas is now no longer with us, at least no longer involved in the story. Any updates on Vestrivan as far as 4th edition is concerned? Okay. Didn't know how that would affect him.
That's a great question. As of right now, we haven't talked about doing anything with Vestrivan. He is still out there, and
doing what he does.
If we do something that explores or involves the dragons a bit more directly, it's possible he might show up, but it's not something that we've talked about or have any plans for.
Fair enough. It was mentioned in the essay, which again was the 2nd edition Dragon sourcebook, about Vestrivan and the horror cloud. Not Vasdenjas, but Vestrivan. Do you know anything about that story?
If I recall correctly, and I don't have the 2nd edition Bar Save at War book right to hand to double check, part of the climax of the battle at Skypoint and Vivane involved Vestrivan showing up and being involved somehow in why Stormhead got shattered into pieces. But I don't specifically recall.
Not within easy reach.
Many of my Earth Dawn books are stacked behind others, and so most of my 1st edition books are not super easy to get a hold of.
Yeah.
Let's see. Yes. It's part of the thing that Living Room Games did with Stormhead and its approach to Vivane. Vestrivan sort of shows up at the Council of Dragons and then flies into the eye of the storm, and there's a big thunderclap. So that's what that is referring to. That is not an event that happened in the 4th edition version of things.
Understood. So,
as I have said earlier on this show and in other places, I was not particularly happy with the way that Living Room Games treated the dragons in their version of events. The dragons kind of carried the idiot ball a little bit, and I didn't like that.
Fair. That's okay. You can retcon.
Absolutely.
Being the game developer. Yeah, absolutely. So I think Vestrivan is a fantastic story and is so Earthdawn rich in this story, in that there's so many possibilities to lace in, as you said, a higher level encounter or higher circle encounters with Vestrivan, Vestrivan's minions, Vestrivan's legend, Vestrivan's lair even, and the Despoiler of the Land's lair. There may be 2 lairs there. And there's so much to use here, or to be used by a game master to, lace things, put it in the background, make it part of the legend and lore of the campaign, or just the setting. Take your pick. There's just so much to use. It should be used.
Yeah, if that's something that you want to use, absolutely, go for it.
If you're going to use a bad guy dragon, this is the one. And again, if you want to have a horror stalker involved in trying to redeem Vestrivan, this is your path in. This is the horror you want to take down. It corrupted a great dragon, air quotes, great dragon. Yeah, go for it. So I got nothing else on that one. So this is a wonderful story with so much rich detail to use for any higher level campaign. This is one hard to resist using this one in any way, shape, or form.
Nope.
Yeah. So, folks, if you have any questions for us on Vestrivan or the Despoiler of Land, no, we don't know the horror's name. And if we did, we wouldn't tell it to you because it's part of the story. So if you have any questions for us, again, email us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. We do love emails. Josh loves answering those questions. I love doing voices. It happens. It works out well for all of us involved. And we go from there. So until next time, it is time for you to go despoil the land of your own legend.
Good night, everybody.